Good morning, good afternoon to everybody that's joining. We'll allow everyone to populate the attendees. All right, got lots of folks coming in. Thank you for joining us today. Allow a few more minutes here as people load in. Like a good turnout today. Wonderful. All right, well, today we have our quarterly U.S. Helicopter Safety Team All Hands webinar. My name is Chris Young. I'll be hosting today along with lots of great presenters. We appreciate everyone that's with us today. We'll be recording this webinar and it will be available on the USHST website for viewing later if you'd like, or share with others that may not be able to attend today. There will be some WINGS credits available and AMT credits for those that have registered in that program and stay on the webinar the entire time. So that's nice to have. And feel free to post questions or use the chat function within the Zoom platform. That way we can, if you have something that you want to ask the presenters, that's a good way to do that. Okay. Just a reminder to everybody, our vision. We are all, the USHST is made up of volunteers from industry and government with its sole purpose to create an industry with zero fatal accidents. Certainly that's a challenge for all of us, but I think we're working hard in that direction, and it takes all of us to do that. So I encourage you all to help out as best you can in participating in the webinar today and other conferences and other ways can help provide that. Our agenda today, we've got a great list of presenters, and we really appreciate those folks that agreed to volunteer. Our first presentation will be from Lee Roskop from the FAA. He has the Rotorcraft Monthly Accident Briefing, which is always insightful. Next up, we'll have Joe Browning from Sikorsky Aircraft and Tyson Phillips from AT Systems. We'll be talking about our helicopter safety and enhancement number 127 Alpha, which deals with the spatial disorientation induced by a degraded visual environment. And so we're looking forward to that. A lot of great analysis from their team went into that. Topic number 3 will be winterizing your helicopter and survival kit in yourself. Jessica Maris, who's a commercial pilot instructor, and then Wesley Vandell from University of North Dakota's Aerospace. He's a chief flight instructor there. And then our last presenter will be Hannah Baumgartner from the FAA, and she'll be talking about fatigue awareness and management. And with that, Nick, I'll turn it over to you to have your introduction.
Yep, thanks, Chris, and again, thanks for setting this up and getting the word out there. Originally we were doing these for 2 hours. We've decided to drop it back to 90 minutes, so we can hopefully stay focused on what we're doing. The one thing that I want to say is that my tenure as the industry co-chair is coming to an end, and the charter that we have in place allows up to 4 years for the co-chair to be in this position. So as of March coming up at Heli Expo, 6th of March, sorry, I will be stepping back and allowing somebody else to take the reins. There was a press release that was sent out there advertising the fact that we're looking for a new industry co-chair. And the sort of person, the ideal candidate we're looking for is someone, maybe director of operations or a chief pilot, someone in a similar role where they're a safety leader and a committed leader, hopefully backed by a company that's willingly seizing the opportunity to advance safety in our industry. So that's what we're looking for. If you think that you could drop yourself into that role and commit yourself to some of the time to do that, then please let us know. if you want to send an email to safety@ushst.org, that will get to us, and you'll be able to nominate yourself or somebody else for that role. The way this will work is between now and the end of January or so, we'll wait for nominations to come in, and then there'll be an interview process before Heli Expo next year, where we'll select the candidate. So I just wanted to get that out there. Another advertisement. There is a press release that describes that's out there. So please take a look at that. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Chris, and get on with the show. Thanks.
Great, Nick. Thank you so much. Certainly, we appreciate all that you've done with the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team for so many years in various roles, and certainly most recently as the co-chair. So you will be missed dearly, and in our thoughts, and not far away, I'm sure, because we'll continue to reach out to you for all your expertise and guidance. Let's do our first polling question, Ashton. All right, everybody, you have the capability to answer this question, so I encourage you to do so. The first question: in the past 40 calendar years, there was only one year when each of the 4 consecutive months of July through October had either 1 or 0 fatal helicopter accidents in the U.S. What year was it? And we'll let those responses come in. We've got about 65% participation from the crowd. Let that keep going. All right, we're about 75% now. Why don't we go ahead and show the results there for that question. So it looks like 38%, the largest majority of the folks in the audience participating, selected 2020. And the answer is D, 2022. And with that, I'll pass on to Lee Roskop, introduce him. Again, Lee from the FAA, and he does our monthly updates, and he helps bring all that data together. I know it's not an easy task, so thank you for doing that, Lee. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. I appreciate it. So for the polling question, for those that either selected 2015 or 2020, those were really good guesses. 2020, as folks may remember, that was the year that we actually had 3 consecutive months with 0 fatal accidents for helicopters in the U.S. But those months were September, October, and November. 2015, also a good guess, because that was one of our best years in terms of fatal accident rates. And we actually had several months that year that were either 0 or 1. They just didn't happen to be those consecutive months from July through October. So really, was a positive for me to see that this is the first time ever from July to October we've had 1 or 0 fatal accidents during those months. So that was very good. And 2002, I just threw that one in there as sort of throw you off that maybe there was a good year a long time ago that maybe had those that met the criteria. So getting into where we're at though for this month's presentation, again, our goal is to reach 0.55 or less per 100,000 flight hours for our average 5-year fatal accident rate. So by 2025, we have a little less than 2 years, 2 months remaining to reach the goal. And where we stand right now for the 5 years that are encompassing 2018 through 2022 is 0.78 per 100,000 flight hours for that 5-year period. Now, the thing with that is good recent news is that we were over 0.8 per 100,000 flight hours for earlier in the year and for fair chunks through the middle of the year. But again, as some of the fatal accidents have reduced over the last several months, that has started to slowly move down. Again, since it's a 5-year average, it's not going to move quickly, but it has been moving in a better direction as of late. To give you an idea what that looks like, just displayed a little bit different way. Again, this bar on the far left-hand side of our chart is 0.62 per 100,000 flight hours. That was our baseline for the 2014 through 2018 timeframe. Far right side of the chart, the green bar, is the 0.55 per 100,000 flight hour goal that will encompass 2020 through 2024. And then these 4 bars in between are staggered amounts of time. So our 5 years in progress, that's where that 0.78 is. For the years that will count towards that ultimate 2020 to 2024 goal, we're at 0.76. Current year, 0.65. And for the month of October, 0.42. To give you an idea what this has looked like for counts, you can see the blue line shows our 2014 through 2018 average cumulative average as we move throughout the calendar year. You can see we got above that blue line on the front end of the calendar year and stayed there for most of the first 6 months. But since then, you can see some daylight in between that blue line and the green line on the bottom that shows our 2022 fatal accident count. And you can see that line, the slope of it, shallowed out a bit. And if we could hold that to the end of the calendar year, if there were no more fatal accidents for the rest of the calendar year, we'd actually be at 0.55 per 100,000 hours for the year. This is based on flight hours this year that we expect to be around 2.7 million. So previously, pre-COVID, we were running between 3 and 3.2 million hours a year. And post-COVID side, we've been at around 2.7 million for the forecast. And the GA survey for 2021, those flight hours are supposed to come out in the next month or two. And we'll see if that confirms that 2.7 million for 2021. Just giving you an idea of how the individual years break down. Again, where we're at for 2022 is 0.65 per 100,000 flight hours, which if it even holds at 0.65, that'll be a big deal compared to where we've been in the past 4 years. We've been sort of mired in this 0.8 per 100,000 flight hour rut, and 0.65 would be the best since 2017, which you can see that that series of years were some of the best consecutive years that we put together for U.S. helicopter fatal accident rates out of all those that are shown on this chart for the last 20 plus years. So what I thought I'd do is try to pull together several of those elements from the previous charts into one chart here. So the way this is laid out is these orange bars that you see show the cumulative fatal accident count as you move throughout the calendar year from January through October, culminating with the 15 that we're at right now. The blue line shows the cumulative fatal accident rate as we've gone throughout the year. Here on the secondary axis, you can kind of see how that's depicted. So front end here, you can see these individual months are along the horizontal axis. In the parentheses, it has the count of the fatal accidents for each one of those individual months, so you can give an idea of how that affected the cumulative. And from the front end of the year, we had 11 fatal accidents through June, and then for the last 4 months we've had 4. So you can see shot out of the gate after January with the 1 fatal accident, we were up above 1 per 100,000 flight hours just by the second month of the year, and with 2 fatal accidents per month for several of the months in between, and then 3 in June. That kept us on the higher side, but it's been on a slow but steady decline since then. Over here on the right side of the chart, you can sort of see how that plays out in terms of number of days between fatal accidents. January through June, it was basically fatal accidents once every 2 weeks, and then July through October, it's been about one every 29 to 30 days. So again, Chris mentioned it on the front end. The vision is for 0 fatal accidents. So that's what will ultimately be completely acceptable. But certainly, we'll take 1 every 29 days versus 1 every 15 days, because that's at least a step in the right direction. So this next chart shows just in terms of occupants that have been fatally injured over the course of 2022. We're currently at 1.08. Again, not where we want to ultimately be, but it is an improvement over where we've been over the past 4 years if it holds up to the end of the calendar year and is more in line with some of these years we saw in the 2014 through 2017 timeframe. And the overall accidents, both fatal and non-fatal, were at 4.74 per 100,000 flight hours, which it's not been a great year for overall accidents. Our number of fatal accidents, our number of non-fatal accidents has been higher this year than some of the immediate previous years, and you can see that puts us on track if it holds up to the highest overall accident rate since 2013. From an industry breakdown in terms of the fatal accidents, there hasn't been one particular standout industry this year that has struggled more so than others. You can see personal private is one fatal accident above 5 of the others that are on the chart. And we know historically, if we do aggregated data, personal private has accounted for now over 30% of our fatal accidents if we look over the last 3-year period. But for 2022, just at one above what these other industries are. So you can see spread out basically across the 8 industry sectors that you see on the chart. And for non-fatal accidents, this is not surprising, at least in terms of historical data. Those top 3 industries add up the percentages, and they account for 60% of our overall accidents this year. Personal private, aerial application, instructional training, and in the parenthetical, that is the raw count of overall accidents for each one of those industries. Then it's a pretty steep drop off to the 4th category of helicopter air ambulance. If you add up all those, that accounts for 72% of our overall accidents for the year. Then we get into the 3 to 5% industries, and then on down to the ones that only account for 1 or 2%. So that's a wrap up of what we've seen so far, at least high level for 2022. Just a reminder, if you're not already using this resource, you can use this QR code to go to the rotorcraft dashboard that we've built in the FAA. It's been out there for about 6 months or so now. If you're on our distribution list for our monthly accident summary, this includes all the data that's in that monthly distribution. It's updated on a weekly basis. It has all the metrics. You can also go to HEI's site. Just go to rotor.org, find the safety link in the center of the page, latest safety resources, then find the US, and it's the top link that's under the US. And again, this is some of the things that you will see on that site, from counts to monthly rates to 5-year, 1-year trends to historical rates going back the last 10 years. There's also an industry breakdown that is on there. We have a make model breakdown as well, and the USHST overall goal metrics are included on one of those pages too. So that will wrap it up for me, Chris, unless there's any questions.
Hey, Lee, thank you so much. Appreciate that review. For folks that maybe fall into those top 3 categories of personal private, aerial application, and instruction flight training, please, let's work really hard not to ignore the other segments, but there's some great resources on the USHST website specifically related to risk management, things like that perhaps could help you personally or maybe your organization that you're with. And another shout out for that dashboard, Lee. I know it's been a lot of work for you and your team, and it's a really great resource. So I encourage folks to check it out because it's got a lot of great data. We do have 2 questions for you, Lee. First one, where do you acquire your total flight hours per month?
So the flight hours per month are based on a few years ago. We asked industry, hey, what's the breakdown of, you're pretty certain that it wasn't just a uniform distribution across all 12 months. So there were some in industry that were willing to say, hey, this is how our hours break down by year. So what we do, we took samples from a number of the various industry sectors and applied those percentages to the overall aggregate flight hours that are provided either by the FAA's forecast or when we get the FAA's final flight hours for the GA Part 135 activity survey. That's how we apply those percentages that were provided to us by industry to break it down by month.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then one more question. How does the civilian fatal accident rate compare to the military?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer that one. I don't know what the latest metrics are on the military's fatal accident rate and overall accident rate. So
okay, no worries. I figured that might be the situation for you. So no, maybe we can find that somehow outside of today. But thank you again for your presentation. Thank you for the data. I hope everyone enjoyed that. So now we're going to transition into our next polling question. So Ashton, if you could go ahead and put that up there. Okay, have you ever experienced spatial disorientation? Yes or no? And those results are coming in, a little over 60% participation so far. About 80% participation. All right, let's go ahead and share that, Ashton. And so a significant majority have said yes. So I think this next topic is certainly relevant to all of you that have found yourselves in that situation. I know it's not a comfortable situation for sure. So with that, I will turn it over to Jill Browning and Tyson Phillips to let them talk about the helicopter safety enhancement that they kind of chaired for analysis. So with that, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. Tyson and I are very happy to be talking about this yet again. We've had the good fortune to be able to take this on the road a little bit. So today, given the amount of time we have, we'll just give you kind of a snippet of some of the information that we've collected and that's out there. This is based on HST 127A, like Chris said, and this is based on some research that was done several years ago, looking at 5 accidents in particular where spatial disorientation was either causal or a contributing factor. So we sort of initiated this project by doing some research. The big question we were trying to answer is, why is it that high time instrument rated pilots, some even dual cockpits, are still killing themselves in DVE? And again, this is what we've sort of discovered while researching this is it's not necessarily only a weather issue. It really is a low contrast issue. We looked at whether pilots are failing to transition to instruments in time, whether they're making improper control inputs, what's the training that's available out there, and is it adequate? So when we looked at the data, you can see on the screen here the average age, the average flight hours, which is interesting because it's 2,600. It's not the ab initio student pilots that are going out there and killing themselves. It's folks with a significant amount of time in type and in aircraft in general. So a lot of what we were looking into is exactly, how are we going to reach the segment of the population that's impacted? Next slide, Tyson. So just a real quick covering what spatial disorientation is, and the definition that we all kind of subscribe to is the inability to correctly interpret the helicopter's position in reference to the Earth. So there are 3 types, which probably are taught academically quite well. The unrecognized, where the pilot doesn't even know that they're experiencing disorientation and they continue to fly as if everything is good. The recognized, where maybe pilots start to think that maybe it's an instrument problem or something's clearly wrong, but they're not necessarily identifying it as spatial disorientation. And then incapacitating, where the individual cannot react to the physiological experience that they have. there are lots of factors that it can impact that, to include just increased workload and things like that. So today we'll talk briefly on a couple of topics. There's more content out there, and we encourage you to go to the USHST website and look at some of the, this white paper that we put together for this, as well as a number of other resources that are available on the USHST website. So we'll talk a little bit about how we approached this particular study. We'll go into some details about some things related to aeromedical that maybe are a little misunderstood by the pilot community in general. We'll give you a couple of tools related to pre-flight planning and the en route decision trigger, something you can incorporate into your day-to-day flight activities. And then we'll talk quickly about recognizing conditions conducive to spatial disorientation and a kind of last-ditch recovery effort. And then we'll give you a call to action. So when we looked at this initially, following the research that the GMDAT did to supply the 5 accidents, we conducted a survey of the industry to try to figure out exactly who was most impacted by this. We were kind of thinking we could narrow the segment down and figure out exactly who to target for this. And I think what was the most interesting out of the survey is that there really was no particular market segment. There was no particular type aircraft or experience level that was impacted any more than any other. So this really is a very broad, a broad problem across all of the industry. So when we started to think about, what training's out there, what are folks getting as far as training, there were different levels based on, the professional pilot versus the student pilot and things like that. But there wasn't necessarily anything that was answering a lot of the questions that we were seeing in some of the data that we received from the survey. So, in doing a pretty deep dive into the SD products that are available, I think one of the biggest things we identified was that there's sort of a gap in some very specific training related to aeromed and really understanding what's going on in your brain when you experience illusions that can lead to spatial disorientation, but also how we train it. And we've looked across different accidents, and unfortunately there have been many recently that we've also been able to look at in a little more detail. And we've seen some consistent behaviors when it comes to pilots experiencing illusions or ultimately spatial disorientation. And we really do feel strongly that there's a different approach to training that we need to start to take. So we'll go into a little bit of the aeromed to give you some ideas about some of the things we've seen. Tyson?
Absolutely, thanks, Jill. So we're going to start on aeromed, and Jill kind of alluded to some misunderstandings in the pilot community, and one of them starts with aeromed because there's more specific things as it relates to spatial disorientation in aeromed. When we look at chapter 17 of the pilot's handbook, it's almost 30 pages. It covers everything from medical certification to alcohol consumption and how soon you can fly, eyes and ears. So it's a very broad topic set, and historically we've covered it in a very rote nature. We ask a question, we get an answer as instructors and evaluators, and we just move on, and we are not putting an emphasis on the key parts of the spatial disorientation piece. We go into the anatomy of the eye in detail, the optic nerve, day spot, blind spot, or day blind spot, night blind spot. While all of these have a value and are important, spatial disorientation should be taught at a separate level. The one we don't do a great job on is the vestibular system. And I'm gonna, for the end, we're gonna look at an accident from 2021 that you can clearly see the interaction of the different orientation system, and we can see how the vestibular system really plays in. Just a quick once over the world, the vestibular system was designed to be used on the ground. It was never built to put us into aircraft. It works in all the axes the helicopter does. and it's our secondary source for orientation. Most of us have been taught through the course of our career that number's 80 to 75 to 85%. I've heard all those numbers of visual, and then 5% is other, with the remainder being the vestibular system. The question that really comes up, and we'll hit on in just a minute when we talk about the interaction of the systems, is why our eyes kind of fail us in these accident sequence. A big piece of the vestibular system is it requires acceleration to stimulate. That movement according to the FAA, there's a spatial orientation packet. It takes 20 seconds of sustained motion to create vestibular illusions. So we see that on board the aircraft. Probably most everyone that's flown has at least been demonstrated the leans, because it's so easy to demonstrate in the aircraft. I'm very interested to see the outcome of our survey, because Jill talked about the survey we did as a team, and we got about 700 respondents. The majority had claimed that they had experienced spatial disorientation. But when we went in and really kind of dug in, our question was, have you ever? If you have, what happened, and then how did you recover? It was really interesting. Of all the respondents, which is about 450 to 500 of the 700, said they had experienced spatial disorientation. Most of them, when they expanded on their experience, they explained illusions rather than spatial disorientation. And what I mean by that is, respondent 22 said, yeah, I've been disoriented. Okay, what happened? Well, I was in the clouds flying on instruments and I developed the leans. Well, how did you recover? Well, I focused on my instruments. Well, that's not spatial disorientation. And I believe, our team believes, that that's a shortfall in how we've trained in the past. We've not been clear that illusions lead to spatial disorientation, but not all illusions are spatial disorientation. I can develop the leans, and going back to the definition Jill started with, the inability to determine the position of the aircraft in relation to the Earth. Well, if I know I'm in the clouds and I develop the leans and I trust my instruments, all I've developed is the illusion rather than that spatial disorientation. Talking to somebody else, or excuse me, another respondent in the same group, their response was basically couldn't figure out which way was up, could not control the aircraft. How did they recover? They transferred the pilot controls to the other pilot. And we had another one that just, he said it slightly different, but basically sheer luck. So those were the ones that truly experienced spatial disorientation. And I talk a lot about this. Jill and I have talked quite a bit in the last couple of years on this. As I talk to people, it's always interesting, because when they start telling their story of spatial disorientation, you can normally tell right away whether it was spatial disorientation or rather just an illusion. And what I mean by that is, it's a significant emotional event to be disoriented. It's a story to develop illusions. I talked about that, we have a 29 pages out of the pilot handbook. The ones that we try to focus on, as Jill and I are teaching, are a couple of the visual illusions and a couple of the vestibular illusions. And the reason is, these are the ones that create us the most problem in flight when we really look at the accidents. We're actually going to look at one accident. It's an Army accident, because we have, my company has the black box data for the purpose of teaching. But it really highlights how our sensory systems interact. So we of course, we got the false horizon, confusion with ground lights. Leans are very common. Graveyard spiral is common. Oculographic and inversion are illusions that are a little bit more, I think, obscure to most people, because it's just not something we talk about a lot. So Jill kind of hit on it, but why are we continuing to have these accidents? Is it a late transition? Do they not believe their instruments, not understand what's going to happen? Overconfidence? The truth is, the answer is yes to all of them. Oftentimes, the accident we're going to look at from 2021, excuse me, they delayed their decision. They did not correctly interpret their instruments, but I can find several accidents that they don't believe their instruments. They misinterpret the response of the aircraft. And what I mean is that they'll input a left cyclic input, and their body, their vestibular system, is going to feel like it's going to the right. So even if they make the correct input, oftentimes the body doesn't understand it. Are they overconfident? Absolutely. A lot of our pilots are overconfident because we've provided training that had gaps. And what I mean is, if we put a pilot in the aircraft, we can trick the vestibular system, but not the visual system. And if we put them in a simulator, we can trick the visual system, but not the vestibular system. So we don't talk to our pilots as we train them, and we train them in these tools. We don't really talk to them about where their training has gaps. And all training does have gaps. We start from purely academic all the way up through simulation in aircraft, simulator, and then in aircraft. All of them have gaps, and it's important to know the value of your training, but also the gaps in your training. And of course, the last one, do they understand spatialist orientation? And most do not. In talking to pilots, I spent last week in Europe talking to pilots in Europe. They understand things similar to how we do in the States, and there's a big gap in that understanding. Real quick, Idaho National Guard accident. Oh, I'm sorry, that slide got pushed one. Idaho National Guard is the accident we're going to talk about, but prior to that, where we're lacking in our instruction, and what's important as a pilot to understand, or as an operator to make sure your pilots understand, is that this is not an instrument proficiency problem. In all my research, I've only found one accident that even could be alluded to the lack of instrument proficiency. And when you read into the accident, they actually don't believe that. They believe they either had a catastrophic mechanical problem, or they had a very bizarre weather phenomenon. It was an Army aircraft, late 90s or early 2000s. But that's the only accident in all my research that an aircraft was otherwise flying straight and level in the sky and established instruments and stopped flying. So it's not instrument proficiency, but rather it's the transition period between IFR and VFR, more specifically IMC and VMC, and vice versa. And it matters both ways. So if we're VMC and we continue to fly into a degraded visual environment or low visibility condition, we're going to run the risk of developing visual illusions. Those visual illusions will lead to our vestibular illusions, because as we go into low visibility conditions, our vestibular system, much like if I have you close your eyes, the difference is that when we have visual illusions and vestibular illusions working together, we get to a point that our brain becomes overwhelmed and confused. As we talk, just for clarity, you'll hear the term degraded visual environment, or DVE, which is low visibility conditions, but it's also low contrast, flying into a rising sun or setting sun, rising moon if you're under goggles, flying over water in a low contrast environment. So it can be a multitude of things that make up a degraded visual environment. There is another gap that we've had in our instruction, is we continue to train as it relates to weather. And weather is certainly the bigger portion of it, but not the only portion of it. So as we dive into these accidents and we look at what's happening and how the sensory systems are interacting, the problem we see and the gap in the training is, as we develop the visual illusion and the vestibular illusion, when the pilot, or if the pilot finally decides to commit to instruments, we see time and time again that the pilot does not believe what they're seeing or fails to make the correct control input. What's happening during that time is our visual illusions have combined with our vestibular illusions. We look at our instruments, the eyes see what is correct, but they're not able to correlate it. The brain doesn't understand. For the most part, when we train spatialist orientation, we train it with the premise of Coriolis illusion. When you go back and look at the audio, or at least the transcripts of these accidents, very few, and I would tell you I haven't found any, but I'm sure it's happened, but very few of these accidents are Coriolis, but rather they're just confused and overwhelmed. It's not that tumbling sensation in all axes. It's much more subtle in how that works. Sorry, let me back up. The training side, where we talk about combining these illusions and understanding where the gaps are and training to combine these illusions, we've got to train the brain to disregard the vestibular system. We see that happen with figure skaters. When figure skaters spin around the first time, I'm confident they fell several times before they were able to overcome that. But now you watch them, they spin around in circles at hundreds of miles an hour, it looks like, and they skate away. And not only do they skate away absolutely magically, and they turn around and do additional tricks, if you will. So we know that we can train the brain to disregard the vestibular system, and that's that sensory interaction. Now, our figure skater is different in the fact that they're not using their eyes and they're not getting that confusion, but we see that we can train the vestibular system. This is the Idaho National Guard accident. And I just want to highlight a few things. 3 Army pilots, 2 in the front, 1 was in the back seat, senior pilots across the board. So if you look, our blue is our pitch attitude, our orange is our aircraft torque, and then gray is our vertical speed. So these red marks each highlight a increase in collective in torque of the aircraft and power. To give you an idea, this aircraft, if you're not familiar, has about 4,000 horsepower and weighed in probably just under 16,000 pounds. So a lot of excess power. So what we see right here as this first red line, if you notice, we're going to start seeing a consistent pitch down. And what we're seeing here is an elevator illusion. So as the pilot adds excess power and ends up plateauing out just under 100% torque, or 100% of the power the aircraft has, we see each abrupt input is correlated with a pitch over of the aircraft. An elevator illusion, as we feel on the vestibular system, as we feel that rise up, not the proprioceptive system, but rather the vestibular, the inner ear, as the inner ear feels that movement up, when the human body wants to push the nose over. And that's what we're seeing at every one of these. So we see the sensory interaction, and we can see our speed is not, our vertical speed is decreasing as well. So again, we've got a tremendous amount of power applied. At one point right here, they're about 35 degrees nose low, and then end up having the accident. If we continue looking at it and we pull the torque out, which I pulled the slide out just because it's a little hard to interpret over a computer screen. But what we would see is, you also see with each pitch excursion where we accelerate, we see the oculographic illusion, which the oculographic illusion is caused by acceleration. That acceleration causes the pilot to want to pitch the nose over. So we have an elevator illusion leading to a pitch over, leading to acceleration, leading to an oculographic illusion, leading to additional pitch over. And again, that's where we see the 35 degrees pitch down on this aircraft. This one, not all accidents are this evident, but this one was so clear because we see very little roll excursion on this aircraft. It's all the pitch excursions coupled with the collective pull. And where that matters is, oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna jump ahead. Jill, we want to talk about pre-flight planning?
Certainly. So looking at some of these accidents, what we're really trying to do now is give you some tools. So training is a huge piece, like Tyson said. How are we going to train to understand what the body is actually experiencing, and then trying to analyze that before you get into a situation where you cannot recover. A lot of this is just recognizing those conditions conducive to spatial disorientation. Once you've gotten into once you've become spatially disoriented, it becomes much harder to get yourself out of a scenario, and you're going to rely on some extreme piloting skills in a lot of cases in order to combat some of what's going on in your brain. So what we wanted to do was give some tools that you can use ahead of time to reduce the risk of actually encountering SD. And one of those things is the en route decision trigger, which gives you the opportunity while on the ground, terra firma, before you go, sets those boundaries so that once you hit them, once you encounter them in flight, you've already got your decision made as far as what you're going to do. So we've provided a pre-flight briefing checklist, and that's available on the USHST website. Some of the things that you'll look at is why are we flying today? What exactly is the driver, the mission driver, if you will, the reason for going out there? Looking at personal minima, looking at pressures, whether they're self-induced pressures or actual pressures. When it comes to weather planning and route planning, focus on that en route weather as well as the departure and destination weather. A lot of times we look purely at the airport we're leaving and the airport we're going to, or the field we're leaving and the field we're going to. And a lot of times that en route weather is where your highest risk is for changes. Looking at choke points along terrain where weather may not be as predictable as you thought, where you may be flying into the sun, like Tyson indicated, those low contrast environments. If you're flying over water with limited cultural lighting, things like that. So when you're looking at the route planning that you're doing already for your pre-flight planning, it's just taking into consideration some extra steps related specifically to conditions that might be conducive to spatial disorientation. Treat that en route decision trigger like a caution or warning, much like in other aspects of flight. You study the emergency procedures, you know what actions to take when you're dealing with a degraded system. This is taking that same concept and translating it over to the weather is not what I predicted. The terrain is not what I predicted. Something is leading me to lose visibility for whatever reason. And when I get to those uncomfortable situations, setting those triggers on the ground and knowing if I slow below X or descend below X or deviate from my planned route by X miles, I'm going to take an action, and establishing what those actions are ahead of time so that you're not doing a lot of things in flight. You're not having to improvise and make those judgments as you go. Conducting a risk analysis, and there are ORM and FRAT tools on the USHST website that can help you in establishing what your personal minima are. And then briefing, whether or not you're flying with other passengers, another pilot, a crew, or by yourself. Sometimes when you say those things out loud, when you actually make those go, no go calls out loud, you will get a sanity check, and you'll realize that what you're saying maybe isn't the most rational decision for today. So there's some checklist items that are available to enhance the checklist, the pre-flight planning that you're already doing. The en route decision triggers, like I talked about, follows the MSPA methodology. They actually used en route decision point, but it's the same concept, and it is setting those points ahead of time and treating them like I'm in a caution, I have a warning light, and I need to take an action, and knowing what that action is ahead of time versus, you know, the slow creep as the visibility is degrading. So when you encounter a situation like this, where it's no longer what you anticipated, are you prepared to make those determinations and recognize what those distances are when it comes to visibility, and doing that training ahead of time so that you're familiar with what 2 miles and 1 mile look like in an aircraft traveling at, you know, whatever airspeed you're flying.
So as we talk recovery, I do want to go back to one thing, and Jill talked about treating them as cautions and warnings. And I don't think any pilot would take a manual, their user manual, and say, well, you know, my manufacturer said that I should not fly the helicopter anymore if this happens. No one is second guessing what the manufacturer says. We're going to execute what the manufacturer says. And that's that premise of that caution advisory, is that once we've made the decision on the ground and come up with those triggers on the ground, that there's no more discussion. When we look at a lot of these accidents, we'll see some sort of planned continuation bias. And the great thing about an en route decision trigger is it allows for planned continuation bias to play into our favor, because we plan to do something before things get bad. Excuse me. When we look at recovery, every aircraft's going to be a little different. The one thing we found, for the most part, common amongst both military, civil, single pilot, dual pilot, turbine versus piston aircraft, was power, attitude, and balance. Most techniques that come out have some variance of this. The Army, which is a lot of my background, has a kind of a broader use of this, but power, attitude, and balance is the kind of keep it simple principle. So power, we want to set a normal climb or a normal climb rate. What works for most helicopters is going to be cruise power. What we do not want to do is establish that massive climb rate, which we saw in the Idaho National Guard telemetry data, where we create the elevator illusion. And I know some of the smaller piston engine don't develop those high climb rates, but they can, and we don't want to create that that illusion. Attitude, we want to put the wings, level the wings and put the nose on the horizon. At a normal cruise power setting, nose on the horizon will give us a climb rate. We're not trying to climb away faster than needed. Now, we need to be aware of where we're flying. If we're in Colorado versus Oklahoma, that climb rate may vary. But by putting the nose on the horizon and cruise power, we're going to establish a positive climb rate. And that's all we want to do at the beginning. Once we're stable and we balance the aircraft with trim, then we transition to traditional instrument scan. And of course, we always want to aviate, navigate, and communicate. I know as instructors and evaluators, oftentimes, as soon as they're halfway under control, we're talking about squawking emergency, getting someone on guard, when we're still very much in the aviate phase. For anyone that's been inadvertent or entered the clouds without any clearance due to an emergency, what you'll find is ATC sees us squawking 1200 in the clouds, and they know what the weather is, so they're aware of what's going on. So getting back with ATC is exactly in place where it is communicate. We want to make sure the aircraft is stable before we do anything else. And again, that's power, attitude, and balance. Oops. So our call to action is expand training programs to include all the various training options of in-aircraft training, simulation, in-aircraft training with visibility simulation systems, as well as obviously a good academic base. Have EDTs every time you fly. When Jill and I teach this at CHC and HAI, I tell a story on myself where I went inadvertent in San Francisco in 2021. And the cloud, it was supposed to be a Clear Blue 22, beautiful day, and it didn't turn out that way. But I had always briefed en route decision triggers, partly from the research of this team. So I had those numbers in my mind, regardless of what the weather really was. So be sure and set yours, communicate to your pilots the same so that they know what to expect.
And that's what we have. If you have any questions.
I will stop the share.
Thank you, Tyson. Thank you, Jill. That was awesome. I really appreciate that. Such an important topic and concern and issue that we've seen in accidents. I really like the points about power, attitude, and balance for recovery. I think it's really important for folks to keep that in mind. And an en route decision trigger, even more important, right? As pilots, before we go out on any flight, doesn't matter if it's for fun or if it's for work, we should be doing some type of pre-flight assessment or pre-flight analysis about what those potential risks and hazards might be out there. And that should be part of that, right? If you know that you have potential marginal weather, that decision trigger should be a part of that decision-making process before you leave the ground, because we know once we're in the air, things happen much more dynamically, and that we often push ourselves perhaps when we shouldn't. So we did have a couple questions that did come in, Joe and Tyson. First one was, you said instrument proficiency wasn't an issue, but isn't it true that a lot of operations are VFR only? And even though instrument rated, the pilots do have the recent currency or proficiency because all they fly is VFR.
Let me clarify. I might have misspoke just a touch. Instrument proficiency is important, because if you enter the clouds and you're not proficient, all you're going to do is live a little longer, which is obviously not the goal of our research. So if I said that I misspoke a little bit, let me be a little more clear. Being proficient in instruments will not get you through a spatialist orientation encounter, but it is necessary and extremely important if you get into that encounter. The recovery phase is not an instrument proficiency issue. Sustaining that after you're in the clouds, absolutely instrument proficiency. So I apologize, I misspoke just a little bit. My intent was the cause of the accident is not the fact the pilot couldn't fly instruments, it's disorientation.
Thanks, Tyson. Another question that came in, what environment is necessary for recovery from spatial disorientation?
I don't know if I completely what environment is necessary. I think that depends. I don't totally understand the question, but I believe that would depend on the operator, the operation, and the aircraft capabilities. I think it also will go back to the proficiency of the pilot for sure. And when we go back and plan those en route decision triggers, I fly a 4-axis autopilot, dual pilot aircraft. My number's probably going to be a little different than a single pilot VFR only aircraft. And the reason is the key to the en route decision trigger is making better decisions earlier. You know, we talk about land and live, 180 out of the environment, commit to instrument conditions, but those are all decisions that need to take place sooner than they are. So we want to be able to execute those decisions earlier, and that's going to be based on, again, your equipment, your proficiency, the structure of the area you fly and its capabilities. So I don't know that answers the question exactly, but that's the conditions for recovery is going to be dependent on the type of aircraft, and really we want to make that decision sooner, so we put a bigger cushion in.
Okay, good. Let's see, we had another comment come in here. Great presentation. I've always taught to level the wings attitude prior to power. Is there a reason you have us think power first?
There is. So I have not seen one recently, but there was a course of several accidents where we saw pilots pitching and failing to add the collective and failing to add the power. And what we end up is slowing that aircraft down and getting into an unsafe condition from a speed standpoint. We lose that airflow across the fuselage by adding power. And the reality is they're simultaneous. We talk power first because we want to get the power setting in so that we don't bleed airspeed off. So that's the reason for it. Some aircraft, I fly a Black Hawk, mine's horrible in that regard because it has a huge wing in the back that programs down automatically. So each aircraft's a little different, but by adding power first, we reduce the likelihood of pitching and bleeding our airspeed, because again, we get stressed, we fail to scan. Adding that power and making it a priority is what we found is going to give the pilot the most likelihood, and then bring that power, or excuse me, that pitch to the horizon. Again, the reality is those two steps are at least near simultaneous, and I would probably challenge they are simultaneous.
Great, Tyson. Thank you so much. There was another comment earlier about it'd be interesting to do that polling question again to see if it changes the the responses. I'm willing to bet, based on what you just described about spatial disorientation, that yes, in fact, those percentages would change. So anyways, we need to move on to the next topic. And I really appreciate that, Jill and Tyson. It was a really good overview, and appreciate all the work and effort you're doing taking this out on the road and trying to educate as many people as possible. So keep up the good work. Thank you. All right, Ashley, let's go ahead and do our next polling question. Okay, how do you or your organization treat aircraft preparation and emergency equipment during the changing seasons in the context of an emergency or forced landing, regardless of your climate? I'll let you read through those 3 options. Okay, we got about 40% participation so far, so go ahead and everybody try to respond quickly. Got about 60%. All right, why don't we go ahead and show those results? All right, the majority picked the second answer option. The correct one would be the first one. We make changes in our operations and equip aircraft with survival gear for each passenger for at least one overnight appropriate to this season. of course, I think some situations are dependent, but that was the general answer that Jessica and Wes had provided. So with that, let's go ahead and we'll jump right in. And Wes, you can go ahead and start sharing your slides, and then Jessica will join.
All right, great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jill and Tyson as well for that presentation. Some of what you said, especially about checklists and decision-making, will tie in nicely to what we're going to talk about here today. But I think before I get started here, it'd be remiss not to, with my background, both on my Zoom and on the PowerPoint here, not to talk a little bit about Frank Robinson, who passed away this weekend. Frank was obviously a helicopter pioneer, an aviation legend, helped many gain access to helicopter flying that otherwise couldn't. So I just want to thank Frank for everything he did. And our topic today, we're going to talk about how to winterize your helicopter a little bit first. And then I'm going to hand it off to Jessica to talk about how to winterize yourself for the changing environment here. This presentation is going to be largely based on light helicopters that are not icing equipped. So single engine piston, single engine turbine helicopters that are flying at least for a somewhat prolonged period of time in a winter environment. So some of the risks of flying in cold weather, obviously there's meteorological considerations. I think that's where everybody's mind goes to when they think about winter, in particular with icing, whether that's structural ice or induction ice, as being one of the major risk factors. But there's also some aircraft considerations. We'll break that down into turbine and piston aircraft, depending on where you're flying. And then, of course, flying in the winter presents a variety of challenges for landing and dynamic rollover, especially in deeper snow. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then I'll touch very briefly on human factors before handing that off to Jessica to talk about a survival kit and how to protect yourself. Just a little bit about my background. I've been flying out in North Dakota this is my 20th winter now, as it seems very fitting because we just had our first blizzard at the end of last week. So it's a little early in the season for us, but we are definitely in winter now. So as an operator, we operate light aircraft, everything from right now we have 5 R-44s. We've operated Bell 206, Schweitzer 300s, MD 500s, A-Stars, all in this environment. And we see some commonalities between all of these airframes when the season starts to change and the temperatures start dropping into the negatives. So if it's your first time flying in winter, or perhaps you're doing a contract work in a winter environment for the first time, these are some things that you should keep an eye out for when entering those environments. On the meteorological side, obviously with lower temperatures, with that risk of icing increases. However, people tend to think that icing is going to occur below 0 Celsius, but it really can occur, structural icing can occur as high as 5 degrees Celsius, and induction ice can occur as high as 30 degrees Celsius. So those are factors that can be even above freezing that we need to consider when flying near those temperatures. The temperature dew point spread is something else we'll need to keep a little bit closer eye on in the wintertime. That's going to indicate your moisture content in the air. And even though there may not be visible moisture at the time, that spread is getting closer together. There's a very good chance that's going to pop up. We'll talk about what effect that will have if you're flying in it. Generally speaking, the aircraft can handle much colder temperatures than the occupants will be able to. And as a result of that, at UND, we fly down to negative 32 degrees Celsius, which is about minus 48. Wind chill is kind of our limitation. But that wind chill and that temperature is for the occupants, making sure that if there was some exposure concerns, if they did have a forced landing or something like that, that the occupants would be able to survive. The aircraft could handle much colder temperatures. But at some point, it's just not a good idea to be operating in those conditions. That wind chill value really should influence your decision making as well. So yeah, the helicopter might be fine. You might make a beautiful forced landing, but how long are you going to be there on the ground? How long would you be able to survive whether you're in or outside of the helicopter. That's always got to be a factor in decision making. Frost is also a major issue in the wintertime, and frost is considered ice. So if you have frost on the aircraft, you have ice on the aircraft, and most aircraft are not authorized to operate with frost on the blades in particular. So that can definitely be a factor, especially if you're hanging the aircraft overnight. We'll touch on that a little bit here. Freezing fog is another one, especially in the twilight hours when the light starts getting low. That could be a major concern and can cause some extremely hazardous conditions to pop up rather unexpectedly as the sun starts going down. I think another thing that people don't often consider a lot with the colder temperatures, winter flying, believe it or not, is actually some of the best flying that you can do. Your performance is fantastic. The air is much smoother. Very hard to run out of power during your maneuvers. However, there are some things that we see seasonally that need to be addressed, typically flying in this environment. Probably one of the more surprising ones is how much your auto rotation RPM can change with that colder, denser air. It may cause very low RPMs when stabilizing an auto rotation that can be fairly alarming. So that's something that you want to keep ahead of. When you're getting into those cold seasons, do auto rotation RPM checks, reset them as necessary. We've had to do those on Bell 206 and Schweitzers every winter in the past, just to handle the much denser air. Idle speeds will also tend to change with that denser air. Mixtures might need to be adjusted in order to maintain a normal idle speed. And then you might start to see some leaks that otherwise weren't there during the summertime. We'll look at that with some piston aircraft in particular, like Light-Coaling engines tend to start to leak when the temperatures start getting colder. And likewise, when it starts warming up again in the spring. So winterizing your helicopter, what can you do if you're in this environment? Obviously, the best thing you could do for the aircraft is typically hangering it overnight or in adverse weather conditions. A heated hangar will keep moisture off of it, will keep the aircraft protected from snow and blowing snow and things like that. But that's obviously not always going to be available. Frost is a major consideration, especially if you're pulling an aircraft out into colder temperatures. That's when frost typically likes to develop. And then we'll break it down between piston and turbine, talk a little bit about dynamic rollover, and then finish up with ice in the air. So hanging your aircraft, again, it's always preferred if you can do it. And most airports in the northern part of the country will have hangar space available if you plan ahead. But we know, there's a lot of offsite work where you're not going to be going airport to airport. If that is the case, some other protections may need to be considered. Even if you do hangar the aircraft, you also need to have a good plan to get out of the aircraft, especially if you need to get out of the aircraft in a hurry. Have a plan, be close to the front of the hangar, train on how to remove the aircraft from the hangar in order to be able to get out as necessary. If you are unable to hangar it, you may want to invest in cabin covers, in blade covers. Those kind of things can help protect the development of frost. Heli covers, just a company out of Canada, makes some great products for most airframes that are available to help protect in those types of environments if you're unable to hangar it. However, hangaring an aircraft isn't always foolproof, especially if you hangar it in the morning and then you pull the aircraft out right away. That's typically when we start to see frost develop the most on the aircraft. Most GOMs or policies and procedures do not authorize the use of anti-ice, liquid anti-ice like they do on airliners. So sometimes the only way to remove ice from the aircraft is to run it up, shut the aircraft down, get out, check the blades, make sure it's removed before firing it up again and taking off. For us, it's usually if there's frost in the aircraft, it has to be put back inside for a period of 1 hour to warm up again, remove the ice, and then typically the problem is removed after that. But obviously that can cause a delay to your operations depending on how quickly you need to get in the air. I throw this photo up here because this is It looks like a nice clear day, but you can see on the fencing outside of the airport, pretty good layer of ice developed just from freezing fog and frost that had developed in those morning hours. So definitely a day when you show up at the airport, probably not a great idea to fly when you have ice all over the building, all over the fences and things like that. Some piston aircraft considerations. First and foremost, it's more difficult to start the aircraft the colder it gets. It's because the oil gets significantly thicker. Batteries tend to get weaker, especially as it gets cold soaked. So that's a major concern when starting up the aircraft. And we'll talk about some ways you can address that. Induction ice, of course, is a major concern, especially if you have a carbureted helicopter. Carb ice, you need to have some way to mitigate that risk and how to operate in those conditions. And then you might start seeing seals, boots for the main rotor, crankcase seals on the engine, output seals on tail rotors. You might start seeing those start to seep and leak slowly as the colder temperatures arrive. A couple pictures of that here. So you might start seeing oil starting to develop out of the crankcase around the tail rotor gearbox. Again, this is a seasonal problem. It's usually something that mechanics in these regions are pretty well versed with dealing with. But again, you must conduct a thorough pre-flight, check for those things. They typically develop pretty slowly and aren't necessarily a problem immediately, but it's something that may have to get resealed and boots might have to get replaced as the temperatures get colder and colder. For turbine aircraft, one of the bigger considerations is the battery condition. Can you have a hot start on a turbine aircraft in the winter months? Absolutely. Typically that occurs when the battery is too weak. On the 206, we had a 24-volt minimum on the battery prior to starting, exactly for that purpose. If you didn't have at least 24 volts, then the aircraft would need to be plugged into a GPU or a battery card to assist that startup, or you're at higher risk for a hot start occurring. Fuel suction is another one. Again, it's not something that we often think about when flying in warmer environments. Jet A is just always available. We don't have to do anything to it. But in colder temperatures, we'll look at limitations for the aircraft because there are different limitations that pop up for those conditions. And then, of course, you need to consider the configuration of the aircraft. Does it have a particle separator? Does it have snow baffles available? Those types of things will make a difference. And then most turbine aircraft are equipped with some form of engine anti-ice. And we talk about when you can use that or when you should use that as well. So as first on fuel, again, just check limitations of the aircraft. If your aircraft using Jet A might only be rated down to negative 18 Celsius. If you want to increase, you can switch to Jet B. Most aircraft can handle Jet B. However, Jet B isn't widely, certainly not as widely available as Jet A. Typically, the reason for that is it's very volatile, difficult to store. You find it in parts of Alaska and northern places like North Dakota, but definitely not everywhere. Fuel additives also help that situation. Prist is a good example. Prist is actually an antimicrobial, but it prevents moisture buildup in the fuel, which will prevent ice from developing the fuel if the aircraft's sitting outside and cold soaking for a long time. It's also an important note to consider temperatures aloft. Even though your temperature on the surface may be above -32, it's not uncommon to have temperatures aloft below -40, which is an absolute limitation for an aircraft like a Bell 206. So consider your environments that you're going to be flying into, as well as where you're taking off from, to make sure you're within your limitations on fuel. Particle separators, that's something a lot of pilots think about in terms of dust prevention, flying in dusty, sandy environments. But obviously, it's very useful in a winter environment as well. Keeps blowing snow out of the compressor for the turbine. They're usually available for most turbine aircraft. And usually they're also combined. So you combine a particle separator with a snow baffle, engine relight systems as well, to kind of have that trifecta of flying in snowy conditions with a turbine aircraft. One thing you definitely have to consider though, just like with carb heat on a piston helicopter, particle separators will change performance, reduce performance slightly. So you have to check your limitations for that. And then of course, again, a thorough pre-flight is essential here. There's actually a couple of accidents back in 2013 that led to this operational safety notice coming out from Bell, just to check the inlet plenum on Bell 206 aircraft, make sure that it is clear, because that led to ice ingestion and a couple of accidents back to back in the winter of 2013. So again, thorough pre-flight, very critical in those conditions. Induction ice, just in general, it's a pretty high risk for all rotorcraft, whether it's turbine, piston, doesn't really matter. Most aircraft will include some kind of protection, whether that is engine end ice or carb heat. Turbine aircraft are typically a little bit better equipped for this. For example, I throw a picture up here of a Schweitzer 300, which the engine inlet is right in the front, that square box. And we actually have that in the past. Snow get packed into there, blowing snow that can, and there's not really any protection. There's no heat that can be applied to that. So again, just something you have to check on pre-flight. Make sure you're not taking off with a partially blocked inlet in that situation. Engine end ice, again, one note here, anti-ice is different than de-ice. Anti-ice is designed to be used as a preventative. Anti-ice is used if you've already built up ice. And most anti-ice systems really are not designed to be used once there's already ice present. So use it as a deterrent rather than as oh, I think I'm picking up ice, what should I do now? And of course, both engine end ice and carb heat will cause a performance reduction. It's depending on the environment you're flying in. Yes, it can be too cold for induction icing to take place. So for example, in the R-44s, if you have a carbureted engine, you're using carb heat. If it's below -20, using carb heat is not necessary. It's actually too cold for that induction ice to occur. But when you're in that yellow arc, when you're in that sweet spot for icing to develop, that's when you want to use it during those types of operations. So the startup, what can you do to address that? One of the most common things to do is to install an aftermarket heater. Tannis Heaters makes STC kits available again for most aircraft. Think of it like a block heater for your car. If you lived all your life in the South, you probably haven't even heard of a block heater, but all it really does is something you plug it in and it warms critical points on the aircraft. Not just for the engine, it also warms things like the main interior gearbox, hydraulic reservoir, oil sump. So you have critical points warmed up that make starting much, much easier. And those aren't particularly expensive. So if you are doing prolonged operations in the winter environment, it's definitely something that you should consider. Plug-in cabin heaters as well prevent frost building up on the windscreen. So that's something else that you can consider if the aircraft is sitting outside for a prolonged period. Barring all that, so kind of a last ditch way to ease startup would be to use what we call preheat. That's a kerosene-based heater. It's basically just a small furnace that when running will pump hot air wherever you direct it through these tubes. Most FBOs in the north have these, and all you really do is let it run for 5-10 minutes, and that's usually enough to warm up the oils to make starting much easier. But again, it's a time consideration. You need to plan ahead, need to see if it's available. So make sure you're doing some research before letting the aircraft sit outside for prolonged periods of time in the winter. A little bit about dynamic rollover. Obviously, snow is a higher risk for dynamic rollover. Even just pulling the aircraft out of a warm hangar and setting it on a frozen ramp can cause a pivot point when one of your skids becomes frozen to the ground. So harping back again, do a thorough pre-flight, make sure nothing is frozen to the skids. Landing in snow as well, need to consider how even the snowpack is. Do you have high skid landing gear? That's definitely a good thing to use in the wintertime. If you have variable snow depths, you may want to consider something like bear paws or skis to prevent getting tail low and having a rotor strike, tail rotor strike or something like that when you have uneven snowpack and you're not quite sure. Last thing I really want to touch on here is just aircraft icing, and I could spend an entire presentation talking about icing and what it is and how to get out of it. But again, I think most people think of this as a primary risk for flying in the winter. It can occur again in temperatures as high as 5 degrees Celsius. That's because the air flowing over your airfoils or around the aircraft will cool down as it speeds up. So even though you might be above freezing temperature, you're not out of the woods as far as icing is concerned if you're flying in visible moisture. Again, most light aircraft are not equipped for icing beyond pitot heat and induction ice like carb heat. So it's something that we must avoid as much as possible. Really two things that we're worried about here. Airframe icing itself typically will develop on windward narrow surfaces. So some examples here from an R-44, building up on the stabilizers, on the anti-collision lights, VOR antennas, things like that are very narrow. They're into the wind. That's typically where ice is going to build up. What the negative side of this, well, first and foremost, you're adding drag, you're adding weight to the aircraft. So what you're going to see is a loss of performance. So increased manifold pressure, things like that, increased power consumption, fuel consumption in flight, which left untreated can obviously be a major concern down the road. Airfoil icing, this one's a little bit scarier. So here again, your ice is probably going to form on your rotor blades before any other surface, just because it's into the wind, it's at higher speed. It's a very narrow flat plate area. So you can get main rotor here, tail rotor as well. You can get icing there and it be not visible anywhere else on the aircraft. Again, you're going to get decreased performance, adding weight, decreasing the aerodynamic efficiency of the main rotor or tail rotor. You can get vibrations that can be very severe if ice starts to shed. You can see on that tail rotor photo, ice hasn't developed uniformly. Some of the ice has shed about halfway down the tail rotor blade, which can cause some unusual vibrations to occur. And then if left untreated, will cause a loss of rotor RPM due to aerodynamic efficiency or inefficiency of the ice as it builds up as well. So just real quick, what can you do if you encounter any of these conditions? Like Jill mentioned with pre-flight, why are you flying today? Do you have to go if the conditions are conducive to icing? Avoidance is vital if your aircraft is not equipped to handle those conditions. If you have high relative humidity and temperatures in that 0 to -10 Celsius range, that's when you're at highest risk. Even if there isn't visible moisture, those can develop very quickly into a fog, freezing fog situation, mist developing, ice crystals developing. All of those can lead to icing fairly quickly in the helicopter. Be especially cautious during those twilight hours of changing atmospheric conditions with high relative humidity and negative temperatures can be very dangerous. We had a helicopter while it was still taxiing out along a taxiway before they had taken off, actually run out of power and have to land on the taxiway, shut the aircraft down. We went out to see what was wrong, and the aircraft, the main rotor, was covered in ice. There was no visible moisture, but less than 30 minutes later, freezing fog had developed, and it was just from that twilight, high humidity type of situation. So definitely something to be cautious of if you're flying in those hours of the early morning or in twilight. If encountered, of course, the best thing to do would be getting out of those conditions. And you can do that by descending or climbing, depending on what led you into those. If you can turn around, if you knew you flew into freezing rain or something like that, turning around, get out of those conditions is the best thing to do in flight. A prolonged flight into it is not going to do you any good or the aircraft any good. It's only going to get worse from there. Do not auto rotate. The reason for that is simply again, the aerodynamic efficiency of the main rotor blades has been severely reduced. So you could enter an auto, but the increased weight and loss of aerodynamic efficiency could lead to decaying rotor fairly rapidly. So avoid auto rotation, keep the power on, because that might be what's driving your main rotor to allow you to land power on. And then to quote Matt Zaccaro, land the damn helicopter if you need to. You know, if you're picking up ice, don't try and make it back to an airport if you think you're going to be in those conditions for longer than absolutely necessary. You know, land the aircraft. We have that luxury as helicopter pilots. Get the aircraft on the ground if that's a possibility in that environment. This isn't really an aircraft consideration, but flat light is also a consideration flying into winter months, especially if you're in conditions where you have a good snow layer and overcast skies, things like that. You get some major low contrast when those conditions pop up, and it becomes very difficult for pilots to perceive distance and speed. The only thing you can really do about that, besides avoiding it, is just wear high contrast eyewear. So whether it's a visor, yellow visor, orange visor, or having high contrast glasses, those types of things will aid in reducing the risks of flat lights. So be prepared for that as well. Final note here on a human factor standpoint, before I hand it off to Jessica, you know, again, your aircraft can probably handle these conditions, but will you? So we have this chart that we use here at UND to determine what type of operations are you doing. Are you close to the airport in our practice area? Are you within power off distance of paved roads at all times? Are you just staying in the traffic pattern? And that kind of determines what you're doing based on the wind chills at that time, rather than just, yep, it's good, let's go fly. You need to be thinking about where you're going to be flying as well. And really what that comes down to is how long will you survive if you're exposed? What is the recovery time? You know, what equipment do you have with you? Is that cold weather gear accessible? All of those decision-making points come up when determining where you should fly in those winter months, as well as if your helicopter can handle it. So with that, I'm going to hand control over to Jessica, talk a little bit about winter survival.
All right, well, thank you so much, Wes. And a lot of what Wes said will segue into this component about winter survival and how you can equip yourself. Pre-pilot, I was a mountain guide, and while I've since given up cold weather sports, some time ago, the mentality of being prepared, of carrying lightweight, versatile, compact gear is still very applicable to aviation. So I would be remiss if not mentioning something about prevention and completing what Bruce Webb might call a pre-mortem. So beyond a pre-flight, but includes anticipating what you're up to, where you're going to be flying, and planning and planning for any potential accident, and then of course preventing that accident. So for example, how can you overfly terrain that it would be better for precautionary or emergency landing if you have those options? And can you avoid more remote regions? Can you follow near towards a road, for example? Or do you have the power to manage a higher altitude that might give you options in an auto rotation situation, or in order to divert to a place that's a little bit more appropriate for a forced landing? And then of course, weather, can you manage your altitude differently to avoid icing conditions, for example, or particular cloud layers? And then fuel planning, not only for your flight, your mission that day, but if you can carry extra fuel, could be pretty helpful in an emergency for fire building or for fuel stove, for example. And then lastly, filing a flight plan, always a good idea, or some other kind of flight following program, similar to Spider Tracks or something along those lines that you or your company might have. And then putting that all together with decision making, the classic pave and I'm safe checklists, as well as facilitating a go or no go decision, whatever is appropriate for that particular mission. And the Swiss cheese model is pretty classic. We're all familiar with that. Anticipating those air change, what could possibly happen during my flight, and making sure I have the equipment and knowledge available to take care of that potential emergency. And of course, hazardous attitudes, fairly common in the decision-making process. And actually about hazardous attitudes, not only in flight planning or in flight, but also in your daily life. How can you notice and have awareness about yourself, some tendencies that you might have, or how you handle high pressure situations that you've been in the past? What of those attitudes might come up for you, noticing any patterns? So worst case scenario, something happens, you're in a winter survival situation. And there's a couple things we're assuming here. For one, it's a somewhat remote region. So those of you who might have answered the middle answer in that poll, or the last answer, B or C, where you don't carry a lot of emergency equipment, if you're flying in city all the time, that might not be appropriate for you to carry a couple days worth of emergency equipment. So I wanted to address that we're talking more about remote regions. And if you were in a forested environment, evergreen forest, and we're also assuming that your aircraft is some flavor of destroyed. You won't be able to you won't be able to turn on the engine for heat, for example, or utilize the fuselage for shelter, maybe parts of it, but likely not the whole thing. And then about 2 days of survival equipment on board. So someone knows where you are, likely, but they can't get to you because of weather, environmental conditions, or whatever the case. And then we'll talk about some adaptations, things like high alpine where you don't have trees available, or a desert scenario a little bit later towards the end of the presentation. So first and foremost, arm yourself with knowledge. Supplies that you carry are completely useless if you don't know how to use them. And then priorities in a survival situation are that list there: communication, water, shelter, warmth, and food. And the order that you put those in will depend on your specific environment, but this is a pretty general order of priorities. Communication being the first, because that's super important. Let's get your location, get your situation, any injured people on your aircraft out there as quickly as possible. And there are a whole bunch of communication devices available these days, so there's no excuse to not have something. If your company doesn't have a tracking system, then these personal devices like InReach or Spot are relatively inexpensive, pretty easy to operate, and are a great way to get your location out there immediately in a survival situation. So the second bullet there addresses charge cords, battery packs, things you might need for a phone or iPad or other device, because in a survival situation, managing people and boredom, for example, mental management of that situation is equally as important. So having some of those resources available might make a big difference in the morale of your crew during that kind of situation. Next, we'll move on to water. Pack some, bring some if you can. If you have the gross weight available to store it in your aircraft, that's great, because you might not be able to find it wherever you land. And then also have a way to purify and a way to melt. Gather should be in there as well, a way to get water, a way to purify it, and or a way to melt it if we're talking about a winter scenario. So there's a few stoves that are out there. Pictures of a couple of them are out. That's a Snow Peak stove on the right, and then a Jetboil on the left. There's plenty out there. This is by no means comprehensive. Another one I wanted to mention is called a Whisper Light, which is a stove that's a little bit bulkier than either of these two alternatives, but it burns anything, absolutely anything. So whatever fuel you might have on your aircraft, you can utilize to make this stove function and cook your food and melt your water. So that's a great little tidbit, that Whisper Light stove. And then don't eat snow. It's a common misconception. Eating snow will sap your body's energy, which could be utilized for other things like staying warm, for example. And then of course you need some sort of storage of water, whether that be a pot or something like an Nalgene bottle that's you can close and seal. You can use it as a hot water bottle at night for warmth, but also it's a great way to store water. And then shelter, bunch of different options there depending on what your specific situation is in your location. You might have a natural area like a recessed rock alcove or part like a small cave, or you could, and this would be a natural examples, or you could build something, a lean-to or a teepee out of whatever environmental supplies that you have around you. Can you use parts of the aircraft, or if it's intact, can you use the fuselage of the aircraft to be your shelter, even if it's parts, cushions of seats, parts of doors, cowlings? If it's destroyed, then take that thing apart and use whatever parts you possibly can for your situation. And then insulation is really important. Wes mentioned wind chill, and that's a big deal, both in the shelter component of survival, but also staying warm and your layers, which we'll get to next. So having that potential to insulate with tree boughs, if they're evergreen trees, parts from the aircraft, plastic, any extra material that you have will make a big difference. And I threw a shovel in there as well. You need some way to dig to capture water for snow, or if you're digging a snow cave, then a shovel would be a mandatory piece of equipment. And then next we have layers and warmth. So ideally synthetic layers, they will perform much better than natural fibers like cotton, but that can get a little bit tricky because synthetic isn't always great in the event of a post-crash fire. Synthetic is basically nylon and it will melt onto your skin. So a kind of a tough, you need to weigh your situation there and whether or not you want some options. Bring both, maybe have cotton next to your skin and then synthetic layers available. And in the event of an emergency, take that cotton away from your skin because it will not do much for protecting you from warmth, and especially if it gets wet. It's a low performing fiber. So ideally synthetic layers. And then you need some kind of wood gathering tools if we're talking about a wooded area, and a fire starter option. There's a lot of these commercially available fire starters, but there are some homemade options as well. For example, a cotton ball soaked in Vaseline is what I keep in my personal first aid kit, and it works like a charm. So there's some commercially available as well as homemade options out there. And a synthetic sleeping bag, if you have the storage capacity for a synthetic sleeping bag, then synthetic is always better than down, especially in a moist environment or if there's potential for any of your equipment to get wet. Synthetic will always perform better and keep you warm even when it's wet. Oh, and real quick, these pictures here on the far right side of the screen, that would be like cotton t-shirt and then a heavy jacket, not as great. Layers are better. So multiple smaller layers that you have versatility versus just 2 layers, something light and something heavy. So moving on to food, plenty of options there in terms of light, easy to cook, easy to use, high calorie, dense calorie food out there. Military pilots in the audience probably recognize MREs. They have a built-in warming system, but they're a bit heavier. And then the freeze-dried foods, they need water and fuel in order to utilize those. They come in a package that you can put hot water right in there. They don't need a separate cooking pot or anything like that. They are pretty nice, and then you can use that hot water inside the pouch, which is a Ziploc essentially, and you can stick it in your jacket and use it for warmth. So those are also really popular. And then I threw ramen on there, your classic starving CFI choice. It's great, it's lightweight, it's salty. Again, needs a pot of some sort and some water, but a great way to have some salty goodness as part of your food program. Plan for 3,500 to 4,000 calories per person per day. Moving on to some other equipment you might need, a light source for overnight and extra batteries. If you store something like a headlamp or a flashlight, sometimes the batteries will wear out with just being exposed to cold temperatures, even if it's not being used. So one good little trick is to store your batteries separately or flip the battery inside the headlamp. I put a little note to myself with tape on the outside, hey, flip the battery. It's not working, not because the batteries are dead, but because I switched the terminals there to protect it from being turned on by accident. And then when you do need it, you have relatively fresh batteries. And then lastly, versatility is so key. Why do one thing well when you can do 10 things poorly? But it works in a survival situation because you do need all of those all those tools. And I would rather carry something and not need it than to wish I had it in a survival situation. So a good first aid kit to address any immediate medical concerns. And then the more versatile your equipment is, the better off you will be. So some adaptations for different environments. Let's say, for example, you have a snowy environment, but no trees. It's above tree line, it's high alpine. A lot of these adaptations are going to be the same. Water is likely going to be the same. Food will likely be the same. Where you'll see the tweaks are in shelter and warmth. So for something like a high alpine, you'd be looking more at a snow cave or building a structure out of snow versus using tree materials. And then prioritizing insulation. You might add a foam pad, for example, to insulate you from the ground, which is now ice or snow. And then having that synthetic sleeping bag on board is going to be absolutely critical. So prioritizing more insulative materials to protect you from the cold. And then warmth, so emphasis on that warm clothes, warm sleeping bags, and that insulation. You have to think also in a snow cave environment, insulating both above you and below you. Cold air sinks, so building a structure, and there's plenty of resources out there, but building a structure that will allow that cold air to sink into a place that you're not sleeping. You don't want to sleep in your lowest point of something like a snow cave. So if you have a snowy environment, but you don't have evergreen trees, so these are a deciduous forest, deciduous trees, again, food and water are going to be pretty much the same. Shelter might look like a combination. If you have enough snow on the ground, then a snow cave could be an option for you, or a combo of a recessed area that's natural and building up snow or material around it to protect you from the elements, especially wind. You might be able to find some trees or branches, but maybe not. So you're looking at a combo of situations there. And then you might have some wood available to build a fire for warmth. Again, that's going to depend on the specific forest. And then a desert environment, lastly. So you do have some adaptations with water here. And I say a large straw or some tubing because there are often trickling water sources in a desert. It might come out of a small crack in the rock, and it might be intermittent, might be a spring. Hopefully it's not frozen, but you might have some sort of trickling water source where a straw can be really, really handy that can then flow into a water bottle like a Nalgene to trap that water, or a siphon type system. If your water source is a small pool, you might need a way to get it out of that pool and into your container, and a siphon is a good option for that. So just a simple plastic tubing is light, easy to pack, and it might save your day in terms of getting water in the desert. And they also need some way to filter that water. You might be dealing with some mucky water, and even simple piece of cheesecloth can make a big difference in getting some of the material and some of the gunk out of your water. And then obviously a more deeper water filter system for purifying. The bottom right picture there is a cool piece of equipment called a life straw. And you literally stick the end into any water source and it will filter your water and make it safe for drinking. So single person scenario, or maybe two people, that would work. If you have a whole crew, that might not be your most effective options, but there are plenty of great water filtering options out there. And then the common misconception that you can drink water from a cactus, it's not realistic, but you can sometimes use a cactus for water containers. Think about a prickly pear, a larger prickly pear. You can use it for carrying water around. And then shelter, sun and wind protection are just as important. You might have cold temperatures, but the sun is still blaring. So often that is an important component for desert environments. Can you use the terrain? Is there a rock alcove? Can you build a rock wall that helps to protect you from the wind, which you can then insulate? And then warmth, there are plenty of plants in the desert that are combustible, and fire building might be an option. So you can use that alcove or surrounding rock to absorb heat from that fire, reflect it back from you. That can make a big difference for nighttime warmth. Even taking a warm rock from that fire and bringing it to your sleeping area could go a long way. And then Wes touched on this a little bit, but what kind of equipment should you have and where? You might need things that are on your person versus in a storage compartment, and being intentional about that placement of emergency equipment. which could vary with your specific environment, your temperature, but it's good to think about that. What do you want where? Things you might want on your person, a communication device like a spot or an inReach, some kind of a signaling device, and then some warm layers. Hat and gloves just tucked into your jacket, your flight suit, in your pockets can really help. And you might be a little warm in the moment, they're helping to insulate your core. But if you were not able to get to your survival gear in the back seat or in a storage cowling behind a cowling, then that might come in really, really handy. So dressing in layers and then having your couple of warm layers available to you. And within reach could be the rest of your stuff, a backpack or a dry bag that has your food, water, your stove, additional layers, your first aid kit, that kind of thing. And then some other things to consider with that storage. Do you have underseat storage? So out like a Robinson R44, for example, outside of the seat, you might have more access to it. You can grab it really quick, but you might not have protection if you had something like a post-crash fire, whereas underseat might be more protected from situations like that. And then think about an MD500, which has a wall right behind the pilot and co-pilot seats, and it might not be easy. You may need to get out of the aircraft in order to get to the back seat and reach some of that equipment. So think about your specific aircraft and what is the correct placement for that equipment. And then lastly, if you do put storage in a back cowling, for example, a company over the summer, I flew for to store their equipment in a back cowling of a A-Star. And if the A-Star is destroyed or I can't get to that cowling, all of my stuff is back there. So you might think about splitting up your gear, having some essentials with you, and then additional storage in something like a cowling. And then in conclusion, again, knowledge is power. If you don't know how to use your equipment, it's completely useless. So arm yourself with that knowledge, plan ahead and prepare, be ready for your specific environment, your specific mission, remember versatility, and then be willing to make adjustments. Communicate early. Again, if you have a tracking program, that's great. If you don't, then get that communication out as soon as you can. And then I have a great resource. This is a nice link, and I'll put it in the chat for everyone. It's rather than giving you, hey, here's a list of survival kit items, because every situation is different, this talks you through some of the options and allows you to cater a survival kit to your specific situation. So I'll throw this into the chat as well as my email. So I need to hop off the call here, but my email will be in there. So if there are specific questions, then I'd be happy to address those.
Well, thank you, Wes. Thank you, Jessica. I don't see any questions right now. We'll wait a few minutes for any of those questions. We will be ending the webinar now. Hannah will do her presentation at our next webinar in February. But are there any questions for Jessica and Wes? It was great information. And, you know, I think for maintenance technicians, especially those that work in the field where they're supporting aircraft, like air medical programs, things like that, I think a lot of these ideas that you provided would be very beneficial for those maintenance technicians that go out there and work on aircraft that could get stuck overnight or something like that. So very good.
Chris,
I know
Thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, there was one comment, careful not to store anything underneath your seat, especially a stroking seat. That's definitely important, because that stroking is designed to help when there's a impact. I know there was a comment earlier about the use of Prist, being sure not to splash it in. It's got to be pre-mixed in the fuel truck prior to going in the aircraft.
Yeah, Chris, if I may address, Tim Tucker also made a comment, the R44, our Robinson aircraft are not certified for flight in known icing. I'd say, just about all helicopters have that limitation, and a lot of fixed wing aircraft as well. So this presentation definitely isn't oriented. We don't want anybody to go out and fly into icing. This would be if you picked it up inadvertently. So known icing would be if an aircraft came back with icing or there's a pilot for icing. We just want to make sure everybody's aware of the conditions that are conducive to icing outside of it already being picked up.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are a few designs out there. S92, I think, is one, as well as AW 159, I think, but with some anti-ice on the blade capability. But again, for the most part, you're not going to have that capability in flight. So avoidance is and proper planning ahead of time is key. I don't see any other questions. So again, Jessica and Wes, thank you so much. A lot of great information. Hopefully folks can benefit greatly from that to help them in their own planning and flights and so forth. Nick, did you have any closing comments you'd like to provide?
Just to say thanks very much for everybody who presented. Apologies for going long. Thanks to everybody who's still hanging on there, 120 of you. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks again, everybody. We'll be having our next webinar in February. We'll put that date out there on social media. Please go to the USHST website. This webinar will be recorded and posted there, and then any presentations that we can from today will be posted as well. So thanks again, and yeah, you'll still get your wings credit for today. Thank you.